and howl about America and democracy. There is no America. There is no democracy. We no longer live in a world of nations and ideologies. The world is a college of corporations, inexorably determined by the immutable bylaws of business. The world is a business. And I have chosen you to preach this evangel.
For all my free market healthcare robbing, stock stealing, retirement fund fucking with niggas. Fuck you little credit card scamming, jewelry stealing, crack selling, liquor store robbing motherfuckers. Shout to the homies, Carnegie, OG, Willie Randolph Hearst, Baruch, Rockefeller, the real Rockefeller, my main bitch Leona, pour out a little Louis XIII, Scott Rothstein, Jack Abramoff, hold your head, my roll chop niggas, let's get this money. I spend my day pimping America overseas, pension for the workers, nigga please, embezzlement, etiquette, private settlement, I'm better with Confederate rhetoric from my mansion in Connecticut, foreclosure Vic homes at the tenement, I twist words like a speech impediment, I hope you got good credit bitch, if not better get a new job with benefits, while I play golf with niggas and get cheddar with, new money buys brand new carrots, my old money bunch of great grandparents, you got grills in your mouth, I ain't mad at ya, I own every gold mine in South Africa. Thanks, baby, you made me $1 billion. Plus, I own a building for each one of my children's children.
And we are live. Welcome to Voice of Rebellion Radio. I am your host, Chris J. And tonight's show is about the Russian Civil War. This is pretty much in a way the viewer interactive show in its entirety because I'm going to be monitoring the chat. The best of my ability and be weighing a lot on the opinion of what people are saying in statements that are relevant to tonight's show about the Russian Civil War. And I give a little bit of background on what happened during the Russian Civil War. That's what I'll do first. And the Bolshevik Revolution of 1917 and the events that surrounded all of it. In 1917, after for the last 3 years, Russia had been at war with Germany on the Eastern Front, and the Tsar had been losing the dominance he once had over his country over the last preceding years, and the Tsar had Nicholas II had reigned himself for the last 23 years prior to that, since he had been coordinated to be the next Tsar of Russia in 1894 after the deaths of his predecessor, Alexander III, who died at a young age as well, but to illness rather than to assassination like Nicholas II would suffer in 1918, the following July. In fact, we just passed on the anniversary, I believe. So in July, he was executed along with his entire family and the royal family in the remote prison, pretty much, that they brought him to, which was actually the governor's mansion, is what it had been called. I believe it was some kind of governor or some kind of position under the Tsar before that used to be the residence of, but the Bolsheviks took it over after they took over the country the preceding October, which this imprisonment was just the end result of the takeover of the country, as the Tsar being executed officially brought away any kind of potential ideas that there was this idea that possibly Nicholas II would come back to power if the White Russians came and rescued him and brought him back to what was then called Petrograd, which is today St. Petersburg. There was this idea that it could happen, but ultimately it didn't happen. And after years of war and a War One, and before that a failed Russo-Japanese War, after years of this, some rather unfortunate mishaps in Russia during the last few years, and what also the Russian Revolution of 1905 kind of fueled this. when in 1905 the Tsar's Imperial Guard opened fire on the protesters, killing 500 people. But there was two different stories. A lot of historians say that they were unarmed. Some people believe that there were it was more rather than a gathering of protesters. It was more like a armed mob ready to attack the Winter Palace in St. Petersburg, which then it was named St. Petersburg. It wasn't until 1914 they changed the name because they believed St. Petersburg sounded too German, and they wanted to disassociate any ties to Germany during World War I. So it was named Petrograd, and then later it would be named Leningrad in 1922, I believe. That's when they changed the name to officially erase any kind of ties to the imperial era of Russia and old Russia, which ended in 1917. The White Guard shooting the 500 protesters was dubbed Bloody Sunday, and this is in the middle of the winter of 1905. That revolution failed. There was then that led to a constitutional reform, and they turned the country with a state duma and a parliament, which the Tsar still was able to control most of what happened in his country from then on out, even though that there was the parliament. But the thing is that it wasn't like the Tsar was completely 100% unpopular, like some people claim that he was vastly unpopular. Still, a ton of the country supported him at the time in 1905, and there's some accounts that it was the vast majority supported the Tsar all the way up to the revolution when he was overthrown. And that's why some people have questioned whether to call the Russian Revolution in 1917 a revolution, really, because it wasn't really, or was it a popular revolution? Is the question. Because there was a lot of vast majorities of the population that did not support the Bolsheviks or their cause, and many, I think, disregarded them as a legitimate political force because they just thought of them to be a non-factor in Russian politics, and they believed just to be some outsiders, which they eventually would take power to the surprise of many people and surprise to all kinds of people all around the world, that these people that failed before 1905, because it was some of the same people. Lenin was there. Trotsky was of a different faction in 1905. He joined really late, really, to Lenin's faction. He was in the more moderate Menshevik faction rather than the Bolshevik faction that Lenin belonged to the entire time. And then he joined the Bolsheviks. Also, Joseph Stalin was just at this time pretty much just a common fighter, and he would rob banks to get funds for the Bolshevik cause. Stalin wasn't much of an educated man at all. In fact, he came from he was just a villager from Georgia that found his ways and got some ties to some certain people, and was able to rise up in the ranks of the Bolshevik movement to the point where he was considered a successor when Lenin was decapitated. And later on, the Bolshevik Revolution would really set the stage for 30 years of Joseph Stalin, or 29 years of Joseph Stalin, which would be horrendous for Russia once it happened. Now, to people that don't see the underlying things behind the Bolsheviks and the White Russians and the foreign involvement, a lot of people think that the United States role was minimal, didn't even exist, or there was just a few troops. You know, the history books say that there was a few troops that intervened, and it was somewhat of a neutral intervention, but that generally the United States took the side of the White Russians, and that the Bolsheviks didn't receive any foreign help. That's what pretty much the textbooks say, or that they got the help of just the Germans via the armored train ride for Lenin back to Russia, and the made some funds, which they did get. But it went a little bit further than that, because the Bolsheviks, what it has been, what some of these accounts I've read, and I was reading a little bit more today, it appears the Bolsheviks had a little bit of definitely one major fan back in New York City, and be more specific, Wall Street, with Jacob Schiff, who had supported the Bolshevik cause very early, well before 1917, but rather in 1905, he had supported, prior to that, the ending of what he believed to be the autocratic and dictatorial regime of the Tsar, and what he believed to be he believed it to be an anti-Semitic regime, and believed it to be him being Jewish. He believed it to be that he could not support anything like that. He refused to loan any money to them. He refused, I think it was more like he refused to, rather than, he probably would like to get the Tsar on a very unfavorable loan for him. But he would not do any favors for the Tsar, that's for sure. And he wrote about his dislike for the Tsar, and he was definitely, and he also his support for his opponents inside of Russia, which at that time there weren't too many, besides this rather fringe group that existed in 1905. These two French groups, which was the Russians, or the Mensheviks and the Bolsheviks, were kind of a split off. These were more radical versions of the Russians. Social Democratic Labor Party, I believe was the name of it. That was the predecessor group to all of it, which really was the first political body for revolutionaries inside of Russia. There had been revolutionary activity going all the way back to May 1870s, maybe even the 1860s inside of Russia, but it was very minor activities. The only real notable event that happened prior to 1905 that I can think of was 1882, when Tsar Alexander II, which was Alexander III's predecessor, was killed in a bombing attack inside of was killed in a bombing attack in his carriage. Some revolutionaries bombed his convoy or whatever, and that led to Alexander III getting to power, which his time would be short as well. I got the names right. It's Alexander II. Alexander III was next, and prior to that was, I think, maybe Alexander I was before Alexander II. Alexander II was, no, it was Nicholas I was before him. But Alexander II was notable because the same people that, possibly the same kind of sector of the population that he freed from serfdom prior in 1862 were probably radicalized serfs that attacked them in 1882 years later, because it was from the horrible conditions of serfdom that some of these revolutionaries were radicalized, and that started the roots of the revolutionary activity that would later build up to 1905, and then 1917 being the huge event that changes the power of Russia for like 74 years. In turn, makes the Soviet Union possible, makes the rise of Stalin possible. Now, the Bolsheviks also had had some other fans too in New York, and it was noted that a lot of people that fled the Tsar's Russia were supportive of the Bolsheviks inside the United States. It's no secret, and a lot of it was the Jewish population of Russia were influenced by people that were in favor of the Bolsheviks, and I think it was more of I think they were more used as tools, a lot of the Jewish population that had fled from Russia during the early 1900s to hate the Tsar and to support his opponents. Now, in the flip side of that, some of the Tsar's fans and some of his allies inside of Russia were also doing mob violence and doing the pogroms, which the pogroms it's not disputed whether the pogroms happened or not. What's disputed is whether the Tsar supported the pogroms or not, which everything that the Tsar said in public, he was never publicly supportive of the pogroms inside of Russia, which were mobs that would go from town to town and inflicting terror and violence towards the Jewish population of that town. But these were some of the Tsar's more hardcore supporters, rather they were split-offs and more of his far-right supporters that were in there, but the Tsar publicly had denounced the pogroms. And for many, many years, under the Russian Empire, the Jewish population had lived very peacefully with the rest of the population inside of Russia. It was until around into the 1800s that the pogroms started to ferment a little bit, as well as the revolutionary activity started to ferment, and somewhat the stability of Russia, the chains of stability that had kept Russia together, started to weaken in the 1800s, setting up for a very unstable Russia in the early 1900s, where ultimately all hell kind of broke loose, because all the most hardcore revolutionaries and some of the most hardcore counter-revolutionaries, far-right monarchists, would ultimately, a lot of these would fight against each other in the upcoming Russian Civil War from between 1918 all the way up to 1924, I think it was before 1923, before it finally completely settled. It was pretty much over at 22, but there were still some battles going on in 1923, and the White Revolution, to understand the White Russian movement and the Bolsheviks, how the two sides worked is that, once the Soviet Union had taken power, and once Lenin had, the Soviets had taken power, and which would pave the way for the Soviet Union. Once Lenin took power of Russia, he had a lot of people from a lot of the former monarchist supporters, and a lot of people that were against the Bolsheviks formed kind of a loose organization called the White Russians, is what it had been dubbed, which were many different kind of groups were involved on the white side of the war versus the Reds, the Soviet Union's army, and other revolutionary subgroups, mainly just the Soviet army, versus the exiled Imperial Army and many other counter Bolsheviks. Because it's funny is that people think it was between right wing versus left wing. All the right wing was on one side, all the left wing was on the other side. But there was a lot of left wing factions that did not like the Bolsheviks. And for example, like the Kuban the Kuban brigade or whatever was a socialist army that was against the Bolsheviks in Russia at the time, and the Kuban was Don Cossacks, a different group. I think it was actually it was like a separatist movement. I think it was a region, and it's not Cuban. It's Cuban or Kuban with a K. I don't know how exactly it's pronounced, but there was one group there that was actually that socialist inside the movement, and it was pretty much a socialist group that was against the Bolsheviks, and also even inside the main one, which was the main White Russian group, there was all kinds of different people in there. There was the monarchists, of course. There was a lot of this hardcore monarchists, which were much tainted in the history books. They like to show sometimes these. I think they make it more black and white. You know, they try to say, well, these people were anti-Jewish. A lot of this movement as a whole was anti-Jewish. You know, as this whole army, but it was just there was some anti-Jewish hardcore. Pretty much, you know, these were fascists before the fascist the word fascist had been coined, belonged in this movement. But as well, there was the liberals, conservatives, socialists. Which the socialists a lot of times were just didn't trust Trotsky, Lenin. They believe and somewhat was a reaction to, on both sides, had committed very ugly acts during the Russian Civil War of terror. There was the Bolsheviks, what they had did, which killed like over 1 million people during what was called Red Terror. The White Russians also did another big widespread act of terror. But also with a mistrust of the Bolsheviks because they believed them to be foreign, believed them not even to have connections to Russia, because a lot of them weren't. For example, Leonid Trotsky was from Ukraine. You had Stalin was from Georgia, but he wasn't really a known figure at the time. You had all these other people that were from Eastern European countries, and you had also ultimately a couple of bankers from Wall Street were known to be pretty friendly with them. There was also Thompson, forget the last. I didn't see his first name, but I literally just read about him today. But Thompson was known as the Bolshevik of Wall Street because of his enthusiasm for the Bolshevik movement, because he believed he could make a lot of money once the Bolsheviks were in power and the Tsar was gone, and completely the White Russians, the whole specter of them coming back to power would be done. Actually, he was supported before the Civil War. So it was actually when he knew the Tsar would fall and the Bolsheviks would take power, that he believed after the Tsar was gone, there was a lot of money that he could make off of Russia once the Bolsheviks were in power. And he pretty much was suggesting regime change, because the Tsar did not exactly allow a ton of foreign investment inside of Russia. He didn't really allow too many predatory financial investors, if you can call them that, from the United States and from major corporations, super corporations of the United States that had become much more powerful in the last 15, 20 years. They wanted in on Russia, which, why not? Russia has a ton of oil, which there was one major group that had some interest, definitely, with Standard Oil of New York and Rockefeller, definitely wanted to see a way to get into Russia to deal, because he was thinking of the mass amounts of oil, or had some idea, knew that there was I think the knowledge of the oil inside of Russia was already known at that time, and that he could expand his empire over to Europe is probably what he was thinking. So of course there was the Rockefellers and a lot of other big, what you wouldn't associate with Bolshevik revolutionaries is rich white capitalist. You could call them that. I think the words crony capitalist, corporatist, these predators over here in the United States that were looking to prey on a weakened Russia without the Tsar to ward off people like them. Because under the Tsar, there was also a heightened sense of nationalism. And I don't think that Russia, particularly the Russians at that time, particularly wouldn't fancy to this kind of foreign involvement in their country prior to all these events. If you went back, especially at the height, before, the 1890s, before the Russian Empire started to seemingly collapse on itself with certain events in 1905 and the World War I, which that's part of also what happened, is that Russia, being it with its hands tied behind its back over on the Eastern Front with Germany, the Bolshevik Revolution happened during all of this happening. And as soon as the Bolshevik Revolution happened, the war with Germany ended, and they made a peace treaty, but it pretty much eroded a lot of the Russian Empire's territories that were going west. And when I said Stalin and Trotsky were foreign, it's that they were in Russia, but they were still technically part of the Russian Empire. But a lot of that was the case, is that they were from the outskirts of the Russian Empire, but weren't Russian themselves, which they saw as foreign. The people that were against the Bolsheviks. And the Bolsheviks and the White Russians both had foreign involvement on both sides. It should be, with the White Russians did get some, well, at least on paper, got some help from some Western countries. There was the mass intervention around 1918 where a lot of Western countries came there to help out against the Bolsheviks, but they didn't really do too much. And actually, what some papers revealed is that actually 4,000 rubles, which doesn't sound like too much money today, but it was worth more back then. 4,000 rubles was shown to go from the U.S. Embassy in Petrograd to the Bolshevik fight, to the Bolshevik movement, and that was actually prior. So some of the stuff is going to be prior in 1917. I'm talking about, and later on, the U.S. kind of took a stand on neutrality, and they were more worried about. Ultimately, what the U.S. was thinking, and what I've read, is that the U.S. wasn't really worried about who took charge of Russia, rather whether they would be able to still use or still think of Russia possibly as a strategic place, their Far East, against Japan, which at that time, it already had been thought about that possibly a war with Japan would be happening in the next few years. And despite the fact that Japan and the United States were on the same side of World War I, there was ultimately hostilities that already started to brew between Japan and Western countries, really as soon as the Treaty of Versailles, once they got to the once they had gotten to the negotiating table, they realized that they had much different interest, I believe. And then a few years afterwards, especially when we're talking about 1921, 1922, it had already been known at that point that probably at some point Japan will get into another confrontation with a Western power. They got into a confrontation with Russia in 1905. And the Imperial Japan just looked already very power hungry and didn't look like they were going to stop anytime soon. Imperial Japan's first major conquest was taking Korea at the same year that they also were fighting Russia, which never looked like they were going to take big parts of the Russia Far East, but the United States intervened and stopped Japan from probably winning, or actually, probably taking over those territories. They did win the war. It would actually have been one of the, if not the first time, an Asian country had defeated a major European power such as Russia. That blow was humiliating to the Tsar, and it definitely swung the public opinion against them somewhat, or some of the public opinion against them. But it's questionable how far that actually went, and also a lot of the people were useful idiots, pretty much. Is that they used these issues by people that were perpetuating the overthrow of the Tsar, is what it appeared to have been like. Now, there was definitely some legitimate grievances against the Tsar. For example, the terrible pay that a lot of these people suffered in hard working days. And it was Imperial Russia definitely wasn't a good place for a lot of the working class of Russia. But anyways, I'm just checking the chat room here and trying to see any comments about that. I'll check back on a little bit, but the sorry, I dropped off there for a second. Seems like it does that whenever I leave the Skype app. It starts to drop off, and it really sucks. But yeah, if you just have any comments, any little piece of information you want to share about the Russian Civil War, the Bolshevik Revolution of 1917, the Tsar era, anything relevant to the show, just leave it in the chat room. Hoping to get a little bit of a conversation, a little bit of a discussion going about the Russian Civil War in general. But it's to no secret that it wasn't as plain cut as it was brought about on our textbooks. Not as plain cut and simple as it's been tried to make. The people have tried to make it seem like when talking about this issue, which is the Russian Civil War. Another thing that people will say is that, well, this is 100 years ago. Why does it even matter today? As that ultimately a lot of these same people that were players then are still players of politics today. I'm not sure, but wasn't Kaganovich, which was one of the most brutal Bolsheviks on the Bolshevik side, which was known for its absolutely brutal tactics in warfare. And he ultimately he said, I think he's the one that said, Ivan Kaganovich, who said that the skirt of Mother Russia has been pulled up. Now we've officially are pretty much saying how he had killed the old Russia as he stood on the ruins of. I think he stood by the ruins of a old church that they had destroyed, and he was one of the people that really believes in just destroying the culture of old Russia completely. And it's said that he was one of the big, he was possibly responsible for over 1 million deaths inside of Russia during the Civil War and afterwards. Because after the Civil War happened, he had a position, I believe, in the Soviet government under Stalin. Stalin, who killed tens of millions of his people, who were political enemies. Ivan Kaganovich was one of the people who was helping pull that off. Well, Ivan Kaganovich, I heard, is related to the Kagans, who are part of the Project for a New American Century, which are a think tank that has all these bizarre far-right ideas of just what to do with the United States and down the road, including stuff like they said that people without jobs should be put into joint stock ran labor camps where they pretty much would do slave labor. They pretty much were advocating for slave labor. And this is a Project for a New American Century, which is a pretty prominent think tank inside the United States. And Robert Kagan also promotes very hardcore pro-Israel thoughts inside the United States with his think tank. And PNAC, Project for a New American Century, if the Kagans are connected to the Kaganovich, Ivan Kaganovich are related to Robert Kagan, that's a pretty disturbing thought. It makes the Robert Kagan just a little bit even more twisted, because Ivan Kaganovich, everyone would agree, if you read a little bit about him, that he was an absolutely messed up individual. Even if you are supportive of the Reds, the Bolsheviks on that side, that Kaganovich would be at least what they would consider the bad apple. But to the other side, would probably consider this to be just another one of them. And there was quite a few of these people that you don't hear too much in the history books of some of these people that were some of the biggest mass murderers under Stalin, that were later, and they all seem to have a few things in common. And one of the things that was in common was it just that really ultimately they had this. They supported. It was a clique, and it was kind of pretty much people. These people stayed around Stalin all the way up to the point where Stalin recognized the second country to recognize Israel was Stalin's USSR. So he kept his most likely. Actually, I'm not going to say most likely. There's definitely this clique of Zionists. I guess you could call them maybe the labor Zionists is what you could call them. It's kind of like the Israeli Labor Party of today, that they say that they're socialist or communist or whatever, but ultimately what their underlying ideology and the only thing they're thinking about is Zionism and support for Israel. And these people did come about after 1917, the Balfour Declaration. So now Israel was no longer a just concept. It already had been promised from Britain to the Rothschilds. So this little clique right here, all seem to all were part of the East European Jewish community from different countries. Which, if you look who created Israel, it was a small little group of, who actually are. If you look at the people that immigrated to Israel, these were mostly East European and European Jewish rather than actually Semitic people. Like they always say that any kind of criticism against them is anti-Semitic, but ultimately they are not even Semitic. They're Ashkenazi. They're descendants of the Khazarians that converted to Judaism around the year of 800 because they were surrounded on both sides, Christian, Muslims, and there were pagans. So they decided to become they decided to convert to Judaism so they wouldn't be invaded. But what really also makes me think that is that because they got these positions in the Stalin government really out of nowhere, they must have been part of that same clique, because it's not like they really had the credentials, but neither did Stalin. So that's the weird thing about the Stalin government, is that they didn't really have credentials. They weren't really intellectuals. These were just a lot of them just regular revolutionaries but somehow landed these major spots in the government. And ultimately, they've become massive murderers under the Stalin regime, like Kaganovich. And I can't really name all these. To be honest, there's many different names that I haven't memorized that were in Stalin's inner circle. But I know, of course, that Makarov was the only other. He was the only old Bolshevik. That's saying a lot of these people that landed in the Stalin government were not even people that had been in the movement too long. The only one that had been there before 1917, besides Stalin, by the end of the Stalin purges, was Makarov. So there's Makarov, there's Kaganovich, there is Beria, who was ultimately eventually executed by Khrushchev and his government. And he was a known rapist and also he was completely demented, horrible individual who almost became the successor to Stalin after 1953. I don't know what's this. I know his first name, but I don't know how to really pronounce it. But yeah, it's Beria. I know his last name. Ultimately lost out on becoming successor to Stalin. And all these other individuals that surrounded Stalin, there was Chekhov, the Chekhov was the spy, was the predecessor to the NKVD, which was founded around 1929. Which NKVD was like a secret police, pretty much, which was the predecessor of the KGB. Which the KGB had a little bit different role because the KGB, I believe, was more. That was when it kind of turned into more about foreign threats. And spying on other spies around the world. The NKVD was more of an internal dissent dealing program that went to very brutal measures to silence people inside of the USSR that were political enemies of Stalin, which most of them were killed or sent to the Gulag program, which is discontinued after Stalin officially. The Gulag program was sending people to these horrid labor camps out in Siberia where they would be subjected to hard labor in conditions of under negative 20 degrees, the wind's blowing at 50 miles an hour, and hard labor out there, and really no set time how long you could be out there. You could be out there for years out at these horrible camps until they were mostly closed down after or they were actually technically the whole program was discontinued, but they had a similar program afterwards. It was put into the regular prison system, but it wasn't officially called the Gulag system. Now there was the book by Alexander Solzhenitsyn, the Gulag Archipelago, that was wrote about the Gulag program inside the USSR, which now is actually a mandatory read in the Russian education today. In the Russian public schools of today, they read the Gulag Archipelago, which for many years Solzhenitsyn was pretty much blacked out inside of Russia. They couldn't get his books, and this is from very early on inside the USSR. I think his books came about in around the 60s or 70s. Well, it wasn't really early on in the USSR, but he actually grew up very early in the USSR, and then I think he left. I don't know, left in the 60s or 70s or something like that, and then he didn't come back till later. He came back during the Putin era, and he died in 2008. And they actually named the street Solzhenitsyn Street or something like that inside of Russia, which I think before that it had some kind of I don't know. I don't know what was the name of the street before that, but I think they named some street Solzhenitsyn Street after that. After he died, which only was a few years ago, but he had a pretty big impact on exposing the Gulag system because the details of it were kind of there wasn't too many details of it in the Western world or outside of Russia. But pretty much what he exposed is that people could have been sent there pretty much for anything. There was no really. There wasn't for the worst criminals of Russia. A lot of them were just political enemies of the. A lot of them were just political enemies of Stalin. And later on, I mean, I think Solzhenitsyn's claims, I don't know how far they go, if he says they went on until through the Khrushchev era. I think he said that they continued. And he made the claim, I don't know how true that is, because I think that he did exaggerate, because it's almost impossible, that 66 million or something like that is what he said were killed by the USSR over the years. I mean, I think definitely there was a huge amount of people that were killed. There was Holodomor, there were the purges, there was the Gulag system where a lot of them were worked to death. There was a lot of horrors inside the USSR during Stalin, but I don't think you should exaggerate and make it unbelievable, because you had 290 million people, 66 million of people killed, and then there was on top of the amount of people that were killed in the war, which is like 45 million. So you're telling me that in that short time, if you add that up, that's 111 million people were killed. I mean, out of a country's population has only 290 million was total USSR. I think at the highest ever, the USSR had 290 million. I think around World War II, they did have 290 million. So, but still, almost like 40-something% of the population were killed. And, in the war, a huge chunk of that's men. A lot of these political enemies were men. I mean, you probably factor in that probably, probably 70-80% of those people that are mentioned to have been killed were men. So it would just say that it was even. 135 million men were inside the country. Then you factor in the fact that 70-80% of those 111 million were killed. So let's put it 80%, just for the extreme notion of this notion. Now, I would say that probably around 85 to 90 million people, let's say 85 million men of the 135 million men inside the country were killed. It would literally cause these numbers that were presented are just almost impossible, because it would literally have caused the population never to have came back as strong as it did mathematically. I think 30 million is a more realistic estimate of how many people were probably gunned down and worked to death under Stalin, but 66. Now, he also said they were all Christian, too, which the Christian population inside of Russia was... it was definitely not... probably 75-80% of the country. So you could tell me that 66 million of these people were... out of these 66 million people, I mean, their Christian population of the country is maybe 225 million or so. And you're going to tell me that also a lot of them became atheists after the revolution. So Christians inside the country, I mean, you're also saying some incredible number that it's almost impossible for them to come back. I mean, some people go, they really discredit a lot of the discredit themselves in acknowledging that these that these events happen or Stalin or whatnot. When they put out these ridiculous numbers, they've even seen 87 million. That some people said that 87 million died under the USSR during all those years, which to me, I'm running the math. These quick calculations doesn't seem too likely. I mean, 30 million, and I think 30 million might be a high number even, because it seems like what starts to happen is that this is just putting out random numbers of how many people were killed and whatever. And ultimately, what you're doing is just pretty much doing, Orwell, but you're just turning the deaths of millions of people into a statistic that you're altering to make your statement, which a lot of times the statement doesn't tread any merit, because, with Stalin, with the Bolshevik Revolution, and all of these faults that were happening in the USSR, and the horrible man that was brought about Stalin, and people like Kaganovich and Beria that came about, and Makarov, and Chekhnov or whatever his name was, that was the head of the NKVD, with all these horrible people that were brought about, you have to realize one thing about it is that it wasn't. If you just look over at Yugoslavia and Tito, it's not that. Because some people say, well, they point to what happened in the USSR, that all socialism, all communist governments are the same, but Tito was also a communist government, but ultimately Tito was massively different on one thing, is that Tito did not want to bow down to any kind of international force, whether it was the United States or the USSR. That's why Joseph Stalin almost had him killed, and he stood up for his people, rather than Stalin, who didn't give a shit about his people. And Lenin said about that he didn't care about the Russian people, but he rather cared about the workers of the world. But really what that ultimately was just a guise for loosely veiled what it appears to me is that it's what it sounds a lot like, is that it was just a guise for loosely veiled international globalism, because I think that ultimately the ideas, and to me, is that even if you do believe that, this idea of worldwide workers' revolution or whatnot, it's a naive notion at best to believe it. But what it really sounds like, and when you hear what he said, Lenin did say, and this is fact, that he said that he wanted a united socialist states of the world. So what he's pretty much just talking about is a one world government. Is that pretty much what Lenin advocated for? And I think he even said that he wanted under a centralized federal state or a federal government to control it all. So he was just supporting the New World Order from a different angle and but it will be for the better of the average worker of the world. And it'll be more peaceful, I think, even starting to go down that route, which that's what the globalists today, from these big think tanks, the CFR or the Trilateral Commission, they try to say that the world will be more peaceful once there's no more nations, once there's no more borders or whatnot. But Tito was a nationalist, and he would never fall for that baloney. And he fought with his country, with his men against the Nazis, and he, without the support of the USSR, kicked out the Nazis pretty much out of Southeast Europe. And Tito led a giant anti-fascist resistance. He was also had fought in 4 different wars himself. He knew how ugly war was, truthfully, rather than how Stalin saw war, which was just a necessity if you want to knock over another country that didn't bow down to the USSR. The war to him, he would just go in and he would use what he called the useful idiots that would support the system because of a few banal statements that he would say, and they would join in on the Eastern Bloc. But Tito didn't want any of it, and the USSR tried to suck up Yugoslavia into the Eastern Bloc, but they didn't want to take a fucking hint, and they kept trying until eventually they decided that they would start trying to kill Tito. And then Tito sent this message back to Stalin: I don't care, or I know what those men that you sent over here to, I know that they were trying to kill me. But I tell you, if you send one more assassin, I'll send one back to Moscow, and he won't miss. So very much Tito said that if you keep trying to kill me, I'll try to kill you, and I'll be successful because I actually have military experience while you sat in your bunker for the last few years during the war. And he also, during the U.S., while his only war experience wasn't really war experience, he just was gathering funds from banks that weren't even that heavily secured during the Russian Civil War. Stalin was just a kind of revolutionary that sat back while it all happens, and he got all the merit at the end, which ultimately, the support of the people that wrote at that time. I remember somebody that was writing about it at the time saying that what he had saw is that maybe 2% of the population would be supportive of the Bolsheviks, while most of the farmers of the country didn't want anything to do with the Bolsheviks and distrusted them and believed them to be con men, pretty much. Now, the one thing that some people have pointed to, though, is that the Bolsheviks did cancel all the international debt immediately that they owed to everybody and decided not to pay it once they got into power. So that must mean that the Bolsheviks they weren't bowing down to bankers or anything like that because they refused to pay the debts. But there was definitely, they had fans of Wall Street for some reason. That's documented fact. You had this money came from the Petrograd embassy from the United States. U.S. government helped them out. There was also optimism, I believe, came from the current prime minister at the time, George Lloyd, knowing that the Tsar was gone, or the Tsar would be gone. So this is prior to the Bolshevik 1917 revolution. Because the British, there had been a recent rift also between the British and the United States. I mean, not the British and the United States, British and the U.S. and the British and Russia, and the monarchies had rifted apart. And I think in the post-World War I world, Britain was thinking about being the most powerful country around, while Russia also had the same intentions. And also, now I'm checking the chat. I found a way to check the chat. Well, decided to try this, but I don't think it works too well on my phone. Is I can check the chat from my phone. Here we go. It just works a little bit differently right now. Oh, it is not open. I guess is the main chat not opening from our. Actually, this is not the main chat I'm looking at. This is from this is the one with every week or whatever, the USC-wide radio chat. Where's the one that's actually trying to find the one that of current events, or I mean current what's actually going on right now in the chat room, what people are saying right now, rather than the one where just like week to week somebody puts one thing up or another thing next. I don't know. I think the chat room doesn't really work from the phone, which sucks. I wanted this to be an interactive show, and it's going to be kind of hard right now with the chat room not really working. Trying to get on it. Well, also, let's keep in mind that so there was definitely this foreign involvement in some aid, maybe some possible opportunism. Maybe that's what this was all about, is that they felt like they could turn the Bolshevik movement into something that it wasn't. Maybe that they just wanted to get to it before Germany got to it. That's what some people say, that Germany would have influenced it more if they hadn't influenced it or tried to influence it. Germany certainly also did their part, and there was a little bit of aid coming from Germany towards the Bolsheviks once it happened. But there was the Bolshevik movement did cancel the debt, so that's interesting. Now, it could be said that because they did what they did, they might have just had all the debts that the Tsarist Russia had that accumulated were maybe just canceled by the bankers. That's a possibility. And that possibly the bankers that was forgiven the debt was just because at this point there was no need to, because now they owned some of the inner Soviet circle. They definitely did own. I think, to me, Stalin was 100% owned, used by the international banking cartel. Stalin was one of them, and he pretty much was just, I think it was easy to mend into their favor because Stalin wasn't really educated, and Stalin was just purely power hungry. He was Machiavellian in nature. So if they would give him more power, he would do what the people that would give him more power would tell him to do. Which was some of the stuff that Stalin did definitely was not pro-worker, but definitely the bankers did get the profit a lot off of the Soviet Union, it appears. And there was also definitely an optimistic idea that they would be able to profit even more than they did, or may not more than they did. May they did profit that much. I mean, the thing is that it was a lot of secrecy and a lot of. It's kind of hard to see actually how much money was made by these big interests afterwards, after the Bolshevik Revolution actually took place. But I can see that definitely Standard Oil had a interest in the Bolshevik Revolution for some reason. It probably was for probably was along the lines of what I was saying, that they were thinking about the vast amount of oil possibly that they could obtain in Russia once the right guys were in power. Later on, though, I mean, the funny thing is that people talk about, though, how close Israel and the Soviet Union were, and they talk about how there was this connection between them, and there was definitely a connection in the 1940s and the 50s. Stalin was definitely pro-Israel. No matter what people say, people will call you whatever, just call you anti-Jewish or whatever, and that's just, oh, you're with all that Jewish conspiracy stuff, blah, 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 blah. People go on and on about how saying that is wrong, but Stalin was definitely an ally of Israel. Though it's in 1967, apparently, people, when the 6 Days War happened between Egypt and the Soviet Union, apparently there was a lot of anti-Israel sentiment inside the Soviet Union, a lot of propaganda posters. What I read is that a lot of propaganda posters were against Israel at the time, and that the sentiment against Israel was very hardcore, even people believing, the Israel to be at the head almost of the conspiracy, rather than the United States, which had been a long time kind of vilified inside the Soviet Union, and was even vilified under Stalin, but it was purely under that notion of they're bourgeois capitalist and we're better because we're under the workers' communist government, but ultimately the workers were suffering over there, and the workers didn't have any say under Stalin of what happened. Some say there was somewhat of a change in 1950 after Stalin died, and somewhat almost of a coup happened, and Khrushchev was changing the country, right? And then Brezhnev was actually the one in power in 1967, and that these people were not. This is maybe when really the Soviet Union truly changed. It was rather more Stalin than the Soviet Union as a whole, or this is kind of a reactionary. This is a reaction to the last years under the Bolshevik government, from Lenin through Stalin, and then that Khrushchev and Brezhnev wanted to change things against the bankers, and that they were not for the bankers. Which, when you look at it, I mean, if they were anti-Israel, and also at the time it seemed that the tensions between the Western world and them really reached a heightened peak around 1960. Was the Cuban Missile Crisis in 1961, and there was also in the 80s. There might have been times when they were definitely not going with the plan that they wanted them to do. But also, why did they continue this animosity against Yugoslavia during that time? That's a question. Why else did they continue this alliance this animosity against Che Guevara, who was actually was fighting to change things in South America and fighting against fascist dictatorships in South America. And officially, Brezhnev decided not to give any support to him whatsoever, and Brezhnev left him to die when he could have saved him if he wanted to, saved Che inside of Bolivia, but he let Che die in October 1967 after he was captured by the pro-United States Bolivian government, which he actually had fought in the Congo to try to overthrow the coup-placed government that had taken over by the United States, and he actually fought in Cuba against Fulgencio Batista. He was fighting against Bolivia against the fascist dictatorship there. And Che planned on changing all of Latin America. But the Soviet Union, apparently, their justification is they signed some kind of agreement with the United States, meaning that they didn't want to get in it, didn't want to break the treaty that they had signed by fear of what retaliation that the United States would do or whatever. But it seemed like the Soviet Union only had a plan on mending countries in the third world to their favor rather than generally helping them. What was kind of the non-aligned movement was Tito and these few other leaders, Nehru and Nkrumah, mainly Nkrumah, Tito, Nasser, this little just group of third world countries that would be opposed to the Soviet Union and NATO, and they were just their own little group of third world countries working together. Because at that time, both power blocks were highly mistrusted in the third world, and eventually they gained a lot more members inside of it, but the original integrity of the movement kind of fell apart when people from both sides of those blocks joined in. And I'm gonna try to check the chat room again, see what I can pull from that, what people are saying, and then try to return to the show. Hopefully I don't drop off. See what happens. See what's going on in the chat room right now. Yeah, that was a while ago. Just catching up right now. The chat room's always got some interesting stuff going on. Sometimes related to the show, sometimes not. I just want, since it's an interactive show, I want to see if people are really participating in it. We'll see what people are talking about, but yeah, well, no, they're not talking about the Russians in the chat room. Definitely not talking about the Russian Civil War. But I wanted to point out this is that people think that this was not that big of an event. They think that it was only they think that was only a few people were affected, but 4 million people died in the Russian Civil War. I mean, ultimately, it was as bad as. I mean, this is ultimately like another front. Really, it was continuation somewhat. I mean, they already suffered the deaths in World War I. Millions of people, Russians, died in World War I, and then they had 4 million more would die during the Russian Civil War, and then there was the 30 million more that were killed under Stalin's purges, and then World War II, there was the 45 million, some estimates go up to, that were killed in World War II. So, but ultimately, it's kind of hard with these numbers because some of them are exaggerated. Like example, I think that the Russian, the amount of Russians or the number that Solzhenitsyn threw out, about 66 million, I think is absolutely absurd because it's not even possible. I think that 30 million is possible, but 66 million. There's all these numbers, and again, it's like what I said, is that shouldn't be done. They shouldn't turn the deaths of innocent people into a statistic. You talk about how horrible it is, but that's what and how they turned, these deaths, these people are turned into a statistic, but that's what you're doing. You're turning them into a statistic by using that to just alter and make your point more valid, because you say, oh, well, at least Hitler didn't, some these ultra right wingers said, well, Hitler only killed this many, your guy killed that many. And anybody that disagrees with them apparently is on now Stalinist. There's only two sides, according to some of these ultra-right wingers. That either you're a hardcore communist or you're a fascist with them. You're on their side. You're one of the good guys, is how they see it. Or you're one of the bad commie, Jew, whatever, that they keep going on. But it's, it's, again, it turns stuff black and white. And I know that Schwing could talk a lot about the Bolsheviks. In fact, we'll just say that I got a little bit of a watch. My links came from somebody that's actually in the chat room. The chat room does contribute. My links about the Bolsheviks, which went on and on. I mean, these links went this is like 20 pages of a book or something like that. Usually internet articles are short, concise. You pull out some information real quick, but you have to really read for a long time in there. But that's why a lot of stuff I kind of skimmed through it because I didn't have the time to read closely. For example, that's why I didn't have the name of the Thompson guy that was considered the Bolshevik of Wall Street, because it was such a long article. I was just trying to pull out the major points out of there. about this guy in the Red. There was also, I didn't point out about the Red Cross operation, that there was apparently New York Federal Reserve, I guess, funneled some money via the Red Cross inside the United States. The Red Cross that were going to go over there and do some aid in Russia. And ultimately, what happened is that actually there was only like 3 of them were doctors, but mainly it was just a organization of some kind of, support, whatever you could call them, technicians, advisors, maybe you could call them, which the help ultimately it pretty much ultimately ended up was possibly what you could say advisors for the to help out the Bolsheviks during the Russian Civil War. And the Russians at the time, this is that during the Civil War, a lot of the Russians had picked up the fighting. There was a lot of volunteers. I mean, that was the thing about the White Russians. A lot of them were volunteers and weren't even paid soldiers, while the Bolsheviks were part of an army. A lot of them, part of the Soviet army, were paid. It was like a grassroots effort, and that's what might have led to ultimately the failure of the White Russians. That they were just a disorganized group, and they weren't getting too much support from people supposedly giving them support overseas, while the Bolsheviks were much more organized, and they had Leon Trotsky, which whatever you see the man, he was a brilliant military commander. And part of it was just because he was absolutely ruthless in his tactics, and he did whatever it took to get the victory. And Stalin later, when he was the commander, he didn't have quite the brilliance during World War II. Nor I don't think he had the will. It's more like, because now it was a different thing when it was World War II, and ultimately all the commanding and all the intelligence that led to the Russian victory in World War II was mainly by lower level people. Stalin just hid in a bunker, because Stalin had pretty much made an agreement with Hitler that they would just stay, that they wouldn't fight each other. But also, when Hitler actually did make good on his word, he didn't know what to do, and he just thought that sending men to the problem. But even with the big giant advantage that the Russians had compared to the Germans and men, it still didn't lead to a win, because ultimately, it barely led to a win, because ultimately that with no strategy, it's very hard to win. And I was looking for that group earlier, the Kuban Cossacks. Instead of the Don Cossacks, there's the Kuban Cossacks. Is that socialist group I was talking about? It was like a separatist group that was for the White Russians in the war, but were a a socialist group at the same time. They were but they were like an anti-Bolshevik state that they formed. They formed inside Russia, and it's in the territory of Kuban. There's an area, and it was declared independent in 1918, and at least some of the people would say it was it was pretty much just almost purely unorthodox fighting these people, and trying to read who was actually socialist in there. I think a lot of the peasants got influenced by the Bolsheviks, and they proclaimed the Cuban Soviet Republic. However, the Kuban Rada declared independence from Bolshevik Russia, and I guess so. Some of these people, I think, that were there was just a split between the revolutionaries. Some of them decided to join the Bolsheviks, and some decided to join the White Russians. Is how it ended up working out. And there was, I was talking about how unorganized the White Russians were. This is where the groups in the White Russians, a bunch of groups were involved. I mean, there was also these separatists involved that had different intentions than the monarchists who wanted to unite Russia under the Tsar. These ones wanted to make their little region separate, whatever. But there was the provisional all-Russian, or there was the armed forces of the South Russia. There was the Siberian Army, Komuch, the Don Army, the Kuban Cossacks, and there was this Alash autonomy, which is like a part of South Russia that wouldn't split off and make like an Islamic state. I think, of some kind, or maybe pro-Turkish state, something like that. And the Komuch was another group. I think that these guys were they were independent, and the initially the Komuch was five socialist revolutionaries. Vladimir Volsky was the chairman of the party of this group. Ivan Brushev, Propkoy Kilomuchkin, Boris Fornantov, and Ivan Nestorov, former members. They had been former members of a group that had been dissolved by the Bolsheviks, and they disgruntled. They decided to join the White Russians during the war. Committee grew in size, and then by the end of September 1918, it grew to 96 members. And the Komuch had a few, once they seized power, they announced a reinstatement. They wanted just simple stuff like an 8-hour workday and trade unions to be permitted, which later on in the imperial era, the trade unions or labor movements have been highly suppressed. And it was true that they were working very long hours, terrible conditions, and were living in very bad poverty, the average worker inside of Imperial Russia. So a lot of them were swayed by the Bolsheviks toward the end, and didn't work very hard to save it once the threat came about. Which, some people saw them as terrorists, but some of the working class inside of Russia, they were seen as heroes, or they're seen as liberators, because the Bolsheviks were seen as a group that would finally do something about the horrible conditions that they endure. The problem with the Komuch was that they were kind of weak and they suffered some defeats to the Red Army. But that's just one other group that was part of the Russian Civil War. There was the Siberians. The funny thing is that actually there was a part of the Siberian population that just wanted to spill away from Russia. I guess they had seen so much bullshit recently that they just decided that they just wanted to get away from it all and form their own, or they wanted and decide to form their own country, I guess. But that didn't really go too far, and there was the main group of the armed forces of South Russia, I think, which or actually, it was just that was the part that they had the volunteer army. They had over at one point the strongest. I think they had 160,000. Yeah, in the summer or July of 1919. Actually, that's just the biggest part of the Southern forces. Just not showing up at the. I think those are the forces. I don't know. There was also the provisional all-Russian government was just this government in exile that would take over if they ever won the war. This would be the government that would take over in place of the Bolsheviks, which the monarchy. A lot of them just assumed that the monarchy would not be able to come back into power, and they believed it to be obsolete, and there was no reason for the monarchy to come back into power. Some of the people were more pro-monarchist, and you had these hardcore supporters of the monarchy and wanted for the Romanovs to retake power once the war was over. But ultimately they lost the war, and the Romanovs fled to other countries, and they're still around to this day. In fact, the Romanovs they were allowed back in Russia, and the Romanovs even have some supporters to this day. That's the odd thing. They have like a monarchist party inside of Russia that wants to reinstate the monarchy of Russia, which I think there's some talk about some supporters want to they'll keep the president and everything, but they'll have the monarchy as kind of an assisting of the power inside of Russia. Well, mostly to this day, I mean that's gone. Any idea of that, but it's funny though that even in modern day that there would still be supporters of that. That was created in 2012 by a prominent businessman, prominent politician and businessman who he said it would be a modern constitutional one, not an autocratic one like the one before 1917. And Putin, I think, has been he hasn't been when he talks about the Bolsheviks and the Russian Civil War. He called the Bolsheviks traitors one time, and there was that one time where I think it was mistranslated somewhat, but apparently he had said that the first Soviet government was disproportionate because it was 80 to 85% Jews in a country that was was only like 2% Jewish or so. I mean, it was 80 to 85% Christian at the time, and that the first Soviet government was 80 to 85% Jews. Which, when you look at the numbers, is not too far off. I mean, it was true that it was disproportionately people of the Jewish faith, and it was not proportionate of the country's population. The first Soviet government, because it was this little clique that existed. Of a lot of them were Zionists, and supposedly some of the Zionists were kicked out in the Bolshevik movement before they could actually really have much influence over the country's affairs. But there was still a Zionist, ultimately, if you look at it, Stalin was very quick to support Israel. I mean, he definitely wasn't anti-Zionist. I would say he was Zionist. He was an ally of Israel for sure. And Stalin, no matter what people say, was that Zionist. So the movement so the Bolsheviks were disproportionate once they took power. This is part of the reason why they were fought so hard against it, that the people saw them as disproportionate of the population as foreigners. And the groups inside of the groups around 1920, many people were, I think, just legitimately concerned about the country, but there were also, of course, the people that were just fanatics and were supporters of, or ultimately just supporters of the far right, that were trying to be a part of the White Russia movement. So it wasn't pure. That's what part of the reason why the movement also probably didn't succeed, is because it was seen as an extreme by some people, because they saw some of these extreme people that were in the movement talk about the anti-Bolshevik movement around 1920 when it came to its height, and then it pretty much came crashing down 1921, 1922, 1923, which also came about was crashing down was Lenin's rule, because Lenin got weaker after he had his first stroke, and he had a second stroke, and he had a third stroke. I think he already had suffered his third stroke by the time the Russian Civil War had been cleaned up. So by the time that he actually had gained full strength of his country, the Bolshevik movement, or Lenin had already been bedridden, and I don't even think he could really talk, or he couldn't talk very well by the time he died in 1924. January 1924, Lenin died, which paved the way for either Stalin or Trotsky to take power. And then the power struggle happened, and Stalin won out because the Soviet, which is like their parliament, I guess you could say, decided that Stalin should be the next ruler of the Soviet Union, and Stalin took power, even though that Lenin had personally picked Trotsky to be the next leader of the country, which Trotsky would really just feud with Stalin for the next few years, and Stalin feuded with Trotsky all the way to the in 1929. Stalin pretty much exiled Trotsky, or Trotsky left on his own. I don't know. I think he technically left on his own. Trotsky then in 1940 was killed by an NKVD agent, Ramon Mercader, who I actually happened to share a birthday with. So it's kind of interesting thing, I guess, is that I share the birthday with the guy who ice picked Leon Trotsky, February 7th. He was born a total of, that's 70, would be 84 years prior, 1915. He was born 98. But it's an interesting, it's an interesting, I guess it's a little interesting thing to share. Also share apparently a birthday. I think it was with Emily Dickens. I think it is, yeah. I think I happened to share a birthday with her, the poet. But and also with Stephen Stamkos, which that's not anyone of really any intellectual. That's just might be the best hockey player in the world. Stephen Stamkos, the Tampa Bay Lightning, born 8 years prior to me. But yeah, you can remember that I have the same birthday as Emily Dickens. Yeah, continuing on the show is going on is that, yeah, there's a lot of modern day applications to this stuff because nowadays Russia faces kind of an interesting time now because you have these people and it's almost 100 years afterwards. And what if something, hopefully nothing happens in 2017 like what happened in 1917 in Russia. But you have these people that want to take out Putin from the inside and that are being enabled by Western bankers, Western forces. You have you have this nut, Korodowski, Alexander Korodowski, who wants to take power of the country, and he's co-partners of business with the Rothschilds in London, and he's been trying to take power. And I think, in my opinion, is that Putin should have never, ever let him out of prison. That's part of his problem is that he let this oligarch out of prison. He threw away a lot of the oligarchs into prison in the early 2000s. And he also, in 2006, officially ended the Rothschild Bank instead of Russia, which I think now has left him with a big target on his head. And they might try something like fund some kind of color revolution, which even these Western powers will admit that they do, is fund color revolutions against European regimes that they don't like. I think they got a big target on Lukashenko. They got a big target on Orban. They got a big target on Putin. They got a few other big targets on a few other leaders over there in Eastern Europe. And I think that if some of these Eastern European governments start going towards poor Putin, they're going to have a big target on their head as well. But Putin is now put himself in a tricky situation, and he's also trying to make the ruble gold back, so that makes their country more stronger, and that would leave more reason for them to try to take out Putin. There was an ex-CIA guy that said that they'll try anything, even if it means putting a bullet through Putin's head, that they'll do it to try to take him out of power. That's their ultimate goal. All this fake diplomacy, all this that we'll try to change, and also this idea that some people think that Trump will get the power and he's going to change our relationship with Russia. That's not going to happen. He's even called Putin one time an enemy of the United States. In one of his commercials, he shows Putin as an enemy of the United States, and he's also very pro-Israel, and he can't be both because Putin, one of the major adversaries to his whole plan in the Middle East of helping Iran and Syria defeat terrorism, is Israel funding the terrorism that Putin's trying to defeat in Iran and Syria. And Netanyahu's made it pretty clear at times that he doesn't think very highly of Putin, and there's a big showdown between Putin and Netanyahu. And also, Putin and Netanyahu has a ton of influence over the United States government. Israel has a ton of influence over the United States government. The New World Order and the top bankers are at the top. The Rothschilds and the Rockefellers, they're higher than Israel. But I'm starting to think that Israel is higher than. That's practically their headquarters. So Israel is pretty much at a higher point than the United States. So really, it's more closer if you want to get to the ultimate showdown. It's more like Putin versus Netanyahu rather than Putin versus Obama. The real showdowns between those two. There's all this fake diplomacy being shown around, but ultimately, in reality, is that Putin and Netanyahu hate each other. And right now, I think that Putin is just being very cautious because he knows that his military is not quite strong enough to take on a lot of the world, which would happen in a World War III type scenario. So they need to be very cautious of what they do next. Because Israel has 400 plus nuclear weapons, and they're not scared to push the button. They're nuts. I mean, these people are racist Jewish supremacist psychopaths that are. Some of them are religious fanatics. Some of them are almost have devolved the ideas that they have. They believe some of them are not even practicing Jews, but they believe Jewish blood to be superior. It's purely a race thing, and they believe themselves to be like gods on this planet. I mean, the former president of Israel said so. That's what they believe themselves to be? What was it? The one president from the 80s of Israel said that he believes, or prime minister of Israel. Rather, the president doesn't actually have that quite power inside of Israel. It's the prime minister that has the bunch of power inside of Israel, which the current prime minister is Netanyahu. Back then, he's the one that said that there are divine gods on this planet or whatnot. I mean, I saw this picture of the Spanish. I recognized the quote. I had the picture of Hitler there, and then they put the guy's name, the Israeli prime minister at the time, prime minister at the time's name, as crediting the quote to him, and say that the picture of Hitler is just to get your attention, because that's what most people think when you say that kind of quote. That's what they think who said it, but it was actually it was the Israeli prime minister. That's the thing, is that where you could put all these quotes and say people, and you ask who said it. Was it an Israeli prime minister, or was it Nazi Germany, or was it from somebody from Nazi Germany or Hitler? And they'll always say it was Hitler, and they will be shocked when they find out it was actually an Israeli prime minister that said that. And there's been, from all different prime ministers, there's been some kind of disturbing quote. I mean, there's Netanyahu saying about the 9/11, and also about how he believes pretty much Israel to own the United States. There was Shimon Peres and his quotes, and all these Zionist rabbis, these disturbing quotes about missiles as relish and all kinds of stuff. Leveling Palestine, how Palestine or Palestinians are just dogs and stuff like that, and how they believe Arabs to be dogs, or how they believe the rest of the world to be dogs, and how they believe the rest of everybody to be pieces of shit, practically. And that's come from the Talmud, because the Talmud says that anyone that's not Jewish is pretty much a piece of shit, and that they're the only ones that are pretty much humans, and we're just there to serve them. I mean, the Talmud, it's no joke that it says this stuff. The Talmud is a racist, horrible piece of literature that it set the stage for a lot of the Zionist terror that they do today, and because a lot of these Zionist rabbis believe that, a lot of the Zionist people, that's what really is. That I don't know if the Zionist rabbis really believe it or just deceiving people. It's that the Zionist people, these Israelis have been turned into have been turned into useful idiots, and are just there to believe. They believe that stuff, but it's the people that actually create the content, the people that actually create the stuff for them to believe. Those are the ones that are actually really responsible for these people believing this hateful ideology, and that's Zionism. Zionism is the equivalent of Nazism. And people will go on and say is that, well, why are you talking about stuff like like this is Hitler-like events? Well, this is like Hitler-like events. 6 million Palestinians have been killed since 1948, which that's a number that they always keep telling us about how many Jews that were killed during World War II. Well, this is how many Palestinians have been killed. This is a Holocaust that's going on right now, and it's continued. It's a slow, painful, horrible thing that they've done to them, and making them live into practically a prison. And worse than a prison, really, because in a prison, you get water and food and everything. They don't get all that stuff in Palestine. And they're locked away behind a giant wall. I mean, in a way, it's like that. When you hear Trump's rhetoric, that's what comes to mind a little bit, doesn't it? The separation barrier, which Trump is known to be a very big fan of Netanyahu and the Israeli government, and that seems to be where it's just pretty much got the idea from. He's getting a lot of this rhetoric. And really, what he's pushing, what he's saying on TV, is just soft version, replacing Palestinians with Mexicans and stuff. of what the Israelis say on their TV about the Palestinians. Because ultimately, Netanyahu and Trump, they have a lot in common. But Netanyahu also is very close to Clinton, because ultimately any president is going to have sworn his allegiance to Israel, or her allegiance to Israel, as we see Hillary's going to become the president most likely. Which, even though with all the events that happened today, I still believe that she's going to win because she's been rigged to win. Clinton is a Zionist sellout and a New World Order puppet, and that will be another New World Order. The next president will be another New World Order puppet and a corporate spokesman, because that's what the president is now. It's just a corporate spokesman of America. They speak on behalf of all the corporations in America, and they don't represent you. They don't represent shit. All they do represent the corporation, but they don't. They just speak on behalf of the corporations. It's a lot of people will still that even listen to this show. A lot of people without, there's a lot of people who probably listen to the show and still go out there and vote, because probably a lot of people there's still some truth is unfortunate. They're deceived and they think, well, I'll vote for Trump because at least I'll stop Clinton from getting the power. Which, if you don't realize, Trump is the same shit. In fact, Trump actually financed Clinton during back in the 90s. Remember, you see Trump and Clinton at the Trump at one of the Clintons' weddings. But there's that. Yeah, you see that picture of Hillary Clinton and Donald Trump together all the time. But people like to believe that there's some kind of difference between the Donald Trump and Hillary Clinton. But ultimately, the whole system is bought out and it's rigged by the New World Order, and they probably already picked a candidate at the Bilderberg Committee a month ago. About a month, a week ago, the Bilderberg Committee was going on, and for sure, that they were talking about it, and there was probably picked a candidate already, because that's when major things happen. I mean, isn't it weird that after the Bilderberg Committee, we see Bernie Sanders drop out not too long afterwards, and after 2008, Hillary Clinton dropped out in favor of Barack Obama after the Bilderberg Committee of 2008. In 2012, already all the other candidates had dropped out. But you just look back on some of the other primaries, and you start to see that some major events going towards who would be the next president happened around the time of the Bilderberg Committee of that summer, which they do in June, and they do it every year. But ones always on the presidential years are the ones that seem to have a lot of weight, because of course they're the ones that where the president is picked, most likely. No, or where the president's picked. I think the president is picked at the Bilderberg Committee. There's the Bilderberg Committee. That's where some of the most powerful corporate and political officials from the Western world meet, and there's a lot of evidence to show that's where the president is picked. And the election is 100% rigged, and people will deny it. But even the president of Russia, of a major country, said our election's rigged, and it's not a little small conspiracy. Putin did said that the election is rigged. To me, there is no doubt that the election's rigged, and the only reason I would vote in it is just a protest vote, just more of a sign. Whatever third party candidate pick, I would never vote for Clinton and Trump, and I would never vote thinking that my vote actually will make a difference. I know that from the very beginning. And just be purely out of protest, That's the people that believe in this electoral system, people that believe in the elections, people that believe in the electoral system are duped, and they haven't woken up this late. That's what's a little bit scary, because this information's been available for years and people still haven't looked at it. there's the internet. All this stuff's been out here. I mean, you see stuff that's from 15 years ago and stuff of content about the New World Order and talked about the Federal Reserve and other stuff. And this stuff goes back from 15 years ago, sometimes even 20 years ago. This stuff's been on the internet. But you know what else has been on the internet that long? There's been porn on the internet, and people get distracted by that. I'm pretty sure. I mean, that's what ultimately. That's when people think of that internet. That's what they're thinking of that rather than going on websites looking at what they find wild conspiracy theories. Or now it's the Facebook or the YouTube or spending a bunch of time on that. Which YouTube has plenty of great information on there, and Facebook as well. There's pages that post the truth before. A lot of times they get deleted, but they stay on the soft side of those websites. YouTube, they stay on the side of little funny videos or whatnot, and Facebook of little cat pictures and food pictures. People told me, what's you in politics? It's because it's actually something that matters, something that will actually affect your life. All this stuff about the New World Order and the Federal Reserve, rather than the rather than all the bullshit that they look up on Facebook all day. People wasting their time when they could be actually learning something on the internet. They'll be just hanging around on Facebook, just hanging around on all the next new app. The thing is that all this trendy stuff and all these just another social media seems to come up every year or so. One year was Pinterest, and then after Facebook came about, and then Twitter came about, and then after that, Pinterest came about, and then you had Snapchat came about for the phones, and then after that there was, Instagram also came about at the same time, and all these other websites. What else am I missing? I mean, there's too many. There's too many damn versions of websites of all these. Then there's Kick. Which ultimately a lot of these just do the same thing. A lot of them are. I mean, when it comes to the fun value of it, that's what people acting very sheep-like, and that's why they get called the sheep bull of America. I feel like that's when start playing that Payday Monsanto song right now. Payday Monsanto hasn't been on my show in a while, has he? I mean, I think it's been a while. It's almost been 2 years since I had Payday Monsanto on Voice Rebellion Radio. Remember we had Payday Monsanto all the way back in April 2014. That was the first time I had him on. It was April 13th, 2014, way back then on Stable Radio. Remember that show? That was pretty wild. I remember it was Payday Monsanto. I disagreed on some stuff with him, but it was also ultimately a great show. I also remember we had that one show with it was his friend, it was Yusuf Shakur or whatever, Shakur, who I disagree with a lot of what that guy says, but it was crazy how many views and likes that show got. It was actually a show that I did alongside with at the time Cole Johnson, who was at one time a co-host. He came back on the radio for that one show. He pretty much quit the radio in March of 2014. I think after that I went to Joshua Anthony with the co-host at that time for a couple of weeks. I mean, they didn't really have a solid co-host for a while there when I was starting at Stable Radio. I've only had really Vince Easley's the second longest wingman or whatever you want to call him, because it's not quite a co-host, I guess you call him. I mean, because all our shows you didn't contribute. It wasn't like I was asking him to contribute. He did. It was just that his role was a studio man, and a lot of shows who just decided to. I just talk the whole time because I can keep talking. I've already been an hour and 40 minutes, something like that, of me just talking right now on this show, because I got a lot of information, a lot of opinions to put out there. and just level and the interaction just with the chat room now. That's how it's been for the last few weeks. Your Voice of Rebellion Radio. Everybody there's probably a lot of people that tune into some of these shows and probably are wondering, what the hell is going on, because they never really looked into this kind of stuff. Man, that's the problem. I like to get all around the topics when I do a show, and I like to wander off because I like to generally put a base of what's going on into every show, because I want people, because there's always going to be those new people that don't know what's going on at all, and they want to learn. So you got to put that for them to understand the bigger concepts, like when I talk about foreign involvement, Bolsheviks, and talk about people like Kaganovich, Trotsky, and all these people involved within the Soviet circle, and all this other stuff that was with the USSR. Talk about Stalin, their relationship with Israel, which is actually, a lot of people said that the Soviet Union apparently towards the 70s, 60s, and 70s had kind of a cold relationship with Israel and wasn't really the Zionism had lost favor inside the country. Well, that's interesting. I would like to see what people's claims to counter that are, because that's what I read, is that there was a lot of anti-Israel propaganda on the streets of Moscow and around in the country, and there was I don't know about the streets of Moscow, but inside the country, I just assume, because they usually put those really pretty. There in the Soviet Union, they would put those really pretty propaganda posters and whatever inside the capital, but there was also the sentiment in the official opinion, or what the government had been saying publicly about Israel, had became very harsh, apparently, towards the later parts of the Soviet Union. And then Gorbachev reestablished relations with Israel. Also, the diplomatic relations apparently dropped off between Israel and the Soviet Union. That the Soviet Union had publicly supported Nasser, is what I had read. And I was hoping for somebody in the chat room to maybe make a counter on that, because that's one thing I couldn't really counter with that, because I've came to somewhat of a realization when I read the part. I used to side with the Bolsheviks in the argument of the Russian Civil War, and used to think that they were some kind of anti-truly revolutionaries that fought for the working class. But then I read a little bit about Lenin, and read about his support for pretty much what's when he talked about the United Socialist States of the world, and the government, like a federal government for the entire planet that they would answer to. It pretty much sounded just exactly like when Rockefeller or some globalist talks about the New World Order, what Lenin was talking about there. So when I saw that about Lenin, yeah, of course I realized that Lenin, Trotsky, Stalin, they were all belonged in the same category of horde, which was what these crimes that they committed, and that these were definitely, this is a foreign supported thing to overthrow what was a popular government, the Tsar. I'm starting to think that was highly exaggerated when I read these claims about, that only 2% in some areas were actually supporting the Bolsheviks, and that the vast majority was not involved with politics, which that was probably true, that a lot of them were just not involved with politics, or were monarchist or pro-monarchy supporters. I know there were a lot of pro-Tsar supporters that would go around inside of Moscow, and there was also the Cossacks that were pro-monarchy, that were pretty much volunteers inside of Russia. And sorry, the number to call. The number to call the show is 718-717-8296. But the problem is, I don't have anyone to answer the call, because my version of Skype doesn't allow me to take calls in. That's why I used to have Vince do. So ever since there is no line available, that's why I used to, people that read the Facebook descriptions of the show, notice that I don't put the call in this number to participate in the show. Now I say go to the chat room, because the chat room is the only place to participate in this show. It's no longer the it's no longer we don't have the call line as of now. I mean, that's why I'm kind of looking for any kind of just studio man or something to take the call. I know I could just get a laptop or whatever, but laptop. It would be kind of disappointing on my part to. I don't know. That's a lot of money to dish out for just one purpose, because Tablet does everything else for me practically, including having Skype, including being able to go to the browser, go into the chat room or whatnot. But there's no one to pick up the call, so everyone that sees that, yeah. I was trying to read what this guy. He says. Talks about FDR. Oh yeah, Ben Cecily gave me a little bit of a shout out. It's just Ben Cecily showing up in the chat room is a little nice. See him. They still hang around UCY a little bit. He did a kick-ass job the few months that we had him here on Voice Rebellion Radio, and whatever project he's looking towards next, I'm gonna support it, and hopefully he's doing all right. And, if anyone actually wants to seriously inquire on this, I mean, I didn't want to go very public about the little troubles been having with this, it's not really troubles, because I think I do good solo, but it is kind of bad that I can't have anybody contribute as callers because of that. Because that little technicality that I can't take the call because of my version of Skype. So, I don't, if anyone's interested in, being the studio man, that's purely what it'd be, because a co-host, I would like to be somebody I've known for a while. I would rather somebody that I've just met recently. That's the only role, is just work up from the studio man up to maybe being a co-host. But if anyone is a little bit interested in that, you can inquire it. I'll put a number out in the chat room, and I'll put a number out there in the chat room, because I don't want to put it out to everybody that's listening, just to people that are inquiring. But that's my private. That's my phone number that you can call me, and you can have a little bit of talk. Why not? Well, ultimately, yeah. The problem just comes down to that I don't have the Skype to actually work with it. If there's a way, if there's a way I can do it without the Skype, like you transfer the call into the Skype call somehow, without being on the Skype app or whatever. The thing is that it doesn't really have effective conference calling when you do it off the Kindle app or whatever. The Kindle Skype app sucks. It's like the only one that ever has that problem. Or it's the tablet Skype app or something like that. Because I had another tablet at one point, and it didn't work either. But yeah, I want to go back to what I was talking about. The actual show is that with the Russians and the Bolshevik movement, there was people don't know half of it. It seems like they don't know anything about. I see a lot of people talking smack though about the socialists as a whole, and talking that they say that they and then they'll say that they wish that the White Russians had won the war or whatever. But the funny thing is that the government that the White Russians had set up they were pretty much. I mean, a big part of the resistance to the Bolshevikism and the true fighters, the people that are actually fighting against all these pretty wicked people that were in the Bolsheviks, were other socialists, a lot of them. So it was not just monarchist. In fact, a big portion of the resistance towards big part of the resistance against the Bolsheviks were socialists that did not like the foreign nature of these people, and did not like the that they believed these people to be con men, pretty much. Which, as we learned, Stalin was a con man. We learned that Lenin, I'll say right now, is that Lenin, their leader, was a New World Order supporter and a globalist. He was a thinly veiled globalist. What he advocated for was horrible. Maybe he didn't realize it. That's the only way I could see it possibly justifying that. He didn't know what he was talking about. He didn't know that he was ultimately pretty much just supporting what the people that he claimed to be against, like Rockefeller and stuff, were supporting over here on the United States. Because ultimately, I think what it looks like, definitely. I'm not saying stuff tonight necessarily conclusionary, because this is one topic I admit that I don't know 100% one way or another, but I'm definitely coming with more and more information. And it's, it really is kind of difficult, because this was a major thing that I thought 180 flip not too long ago compared to what I thought just a couple years ago on the Bolsheviks and stuff, because I didn't know 90% of what I know now about the Bolsheviks and the Russian Civil War. I did not know that the White Russians had all these socialists as well in their movement. I didn't realize that the Bolsheviks had these Wall Street supporters. This is like flip from what I thought years ago. I thought that the Wall Street hated completely the Bolsheviks, and that the White Russians were all a bunch of monarchist Nazis practically, and that a few of them weren't. But I didn't realize that was the small majority, and that the Tsar didn't even really like those the pogroms, and that the Tsar had publicly denounced the pogroms. I thought that the pogroms were done by the Russian government at one point. So there's a lot of stuff that I learned, and it took a lot of researching. I mean, other topics, it seems like you can get to the truth easier, but there's so much debating. This is one of the most debated topics on the internet. If you look at it, it's weird. People have all these different little factoids and a little bit of disinfo also, but there are a lot of factoids and a lot of different names thrown out. And all these people from different countries and different governments involved, and different governments alleged to be involved, and different connections to people, and it ends up being a ton of information to decipher through. And it's very hard to actually make any conclusions on when it comes to the Russian Civil War. But I say that I definitely made a giant flip on what I used to think about, the Russian Civil War. And I didn't even know all these groups, like, really who these groups were, like the Komuch and the Don Cossacks, and all these little different factions over on the White Russians. And there was also like this anarchist group that were on the Bolsheviks that were pretty much betrayed at Kronstadt. But also there was all these different factions, the White Russians, or the socialists, all these different factions of the White Russians, and there was a group there, another group there, and it's pretty confusing. And it's again, there's no other topic I found. I don't know if there's another topic I found quite as as so much information to decipher. I mean, like I said, those articles that I was reading, these really didn't provide too much. They just provided a lot of names and stuff. The main points, it was like 20 pages of reading per article. And I was just reading back on the Skype chat is what it was. But what I've kept, read also just read a couple quotes if you want to see, what Lenin really thought about. He didn't talk too much really about when it came to foreign policy and stuff like that. But when he talks about the United States or United Socialist States of the world and the centralized government that he believed they should be under, it sounds a lot like the New World Order. Read what Trotsky had to say about different things, and you realize that Trotsky, or his real name, Lev Davidovich Brodsky, you see ultimately, a lot of his quotes pointed to a very sick individual who was just, in the end, was just a con man looking for power, just like Stalin was. But Stalin, he wasn't an intellectual like Trotsky, and Stalin was a mass robber who was, I mean, it was, you know what, it's more, a better way of really playing is just he was a thug for them. And he was robbing banks, which actually I'm nothing really against that because usually banks are highly corrupt organizations. But he was getting, but the whole organization was just getting money from the big giant banks. I'm sure those banks were just local banks that he was taking the money from, because you definitely wasn't robbing from the bigger banks. The bigger banks were just handing out the money to them. That's what appeared to be happening. It was Wall Street giving them the money, and there was the Petrograd ordeal, and there was the Red Cross deal. The Red Cross, I mean, it seems like classic modern day stuff that they do with governments. They're trying to do a regime change now, like what they would have done to Gaddafi in Libya, or what they're trying to do. It's like Russia with the NGOs. That's what it kind of reminds me of, is the Red Cross being like what the NGOs and putting and close down the NGOs, because he knows this happened to Russia once before, that the United States uses NGOs, and that's 100 years ago. They learned their lesson, and Russia does not want to repeat the mistakes of the past. So they clamped down and didn't allow because ultimately NGOs just turn into mini spy agencies sometimes when they get infiltrated by spies and people that are trying to influence stuff, and that's what the Red Cross is doing over there prior to the Bolshevik Revolution, or as it could be called, the Bolshevik coup. And just to make clear, this is not me I still support people like Tito, Nasser, who, yes, they're still communist governments, but they were nationalists, and they actually support their people, and they actually did stuff to improve the lives of their people. What happened in the USSR is that the lives of the people continued to suck afterwards and got worse, because before they didn't suffer the kind of the police state that it was under the Tsar was exaggerated, and wasn't even it wasn't even close to what the kind of surveillance that happened under the NKVD and the secret police that existed under Stalin, and the Gulag program, and the mass and the purges and all that happened under that. The horrors were 3 times worse, possibly under Stalin than were under the Imperial Russia, which was pretty bad under the Tsar. He wasn't perfect, but there was definitely what happened afterwards was a nightmare. And we're just about 2 minutes short of the end of the show. So anyone that wants to, this week I'll try. I know I'm not going to just try because I got more time to do podcasts this week. I'm hoping tomorrow I'm going to go on a podcast, go live. Unless listening again, I mean, it gets in the way. So if anybody wants to actually see me do the podcast tomorrow, I'll be on Chris Jackson Rojas Facebook. That's my Facebook. Subscribe to it if you are interested in seeing my podcast. I'm trying to also do maybe a lengthy one. I will at least do a podcast at some time. I mean, even if it's 5 minutes, you saw 5 minutes, 15 minutes, whatever. At least you got to see 15 minutes of content. And I do, in my 15 minutes content, I try to get a lot out real quick. Rather than 2 hours, it's a little bit different format. You explain and you put out all the little details, and it's 2 hours of talking. You got a lot more time to spread out stuff. So you don't really quite put a ton of information out real quick. Kind of, tell it like a story, and you tell it in different parts. But when you have 15 minutes, you put out a lot of information real quick. So I still put out a lot of information in 15 minutes. So if you are interested in seeing that, definitely go and tune in. We just a few minutes away till the, or not a few seconds, like 40 seconds away from the end of the show. So if you haven't done that, subscribe to Chris Jackson.
Running no return and nobody can stop it. Malcolm Little when he knelt before Elijah Muhammad, the comet that killed the dinosaurs, changing the earth. They love to criticize, they always say I changed for the worse. Like prescription pills when you misusing them, nigga. The Templar Knights when they took Jerusalem, nigga, and figured out what was buried under Solomon's temple, Al-Aqsa. The name is not coincidental. I know too much, the government is trying to murder me. No coming back like cutting your wrists open vertically. How could the serpent be perfect purposely put in charge of the country. Genetic engineered sickness spread amongst me. My people are so hungry that they attack without reason, like a fucking dog ripping off the hand that feeds them. Immortal technique is treason to the Patriot Act. So come and get me, motherfucker, cause I'm not coming back. This is the point from which I can never return. And if I back down